Hello, everybody. Welcome. Today we'll be talking about Chapter 13 for Zoology today, which is the phylum Cnidaria, which includes all cnidarians, which look similar to this, right? So sea anemones, jellyfish, Portuguese men of war. The oldest fossils date back to 700 million years ago for cnidarians. General characteristics, they are soft-bodied, aquatic and mostly marine, so mostly saltwater. They display radial symmetry. They are carnivores, diploblastic. They have incomplete guts, no coeloms because they're diploblastic. They have stinging tentacles, and we see some examples there. There are two basic body types for cnidarians. They either have the medusa, which is the free-swimming body type, think of a jellyfish, or the sessile polyp form, which doesn't move. It adheres to the substrate of the sea floor. Think sea anemone, right? So medusa, the jellyfish form, polyp is the sea anemone form. One of the defining traits of a cnidarian is the stinging tentacles. The stinging tentacles have a cell in them called cnidocytes. Cnidocytes are the stinging cells themselves, and inside each cnidocyte is what's called a nematocyst. A nematocyst is the part of the cell that actually does the physical stinging. And so what happens is here is a cnidocyte, right? So the stinging cell. And inside is the nematocyst, the little organelle inside the cell that does the stinging. And so what happens is each stinging cell has what's called a cnidocyl. Cnidocyl is basically like a little hair trigger. And when that cnidocyl is touched, manipulated, whatever, it triggers the cell to burst open. The nematocyst comes out like shooting insanely fast, where it's got this filament that comes out. The filament is filled with a toxin that's released, and that's part of the pain from the sting. And it also has a barb on the nematocyst. The nematocyst will stay in the skin. If you've ever been stung by a jellyfish or any kind of cnidarian, you've probably noticed that the tentacle seems to stick to you a little bit, and it's hard to get off, and it's painful to get off, and that's because of these barbs. You should have watched the video, like how the nematocyst discharges and everything like that. A couple of the words to point out, the operculum is the cap that surrounds the filament before it launches, right? So the operculum you can see in this picture here, or it'd be on the outside here. It's kind of the cap on top. There are only a few jellyfish, like the box jellyfish or the Portuguese man of war, that can be very harmful to humans. Most just cause slight irritation when stung. If you're ever stung, a few pieces of advice. The first thing you should do is try to very gently make sure you actually get the tentacle off of you. So the longer the tentacle is on you, the more likely you are to be stung more. Second piece of advice is the liquid you should use to rinse it is actually vinegar and not urine. Urine could be used in an emergency as a last resort, but you would use vinegar or even seawater before you use urine. And we can see here in this picture kind of the extreme welts left by a box jellyfish. Some other senses and characteristics that cnidarians have. They have sense organs for balance called statocysts, and for photosensitivity called ocellus. Cnidarians also have a simple nerve net. It's not a brain, but it's neurons scattered throughout their body that allow them to detect certain things like photosensitivity or balance if they're upside down, or if something's touching them. They have no excretory system or respiratory system. They reproduce both asexually through budding in polyps and sexually through releasing sperm and egg. Okay, so the first animal group we're talking about is class Hydrozoa, which includes the Portuguese man of war and Hydra. So class Hydrozoa are mostly marine and mostly colonial organisms with both polyps and medusa forms. Being a colonial organism is kind of like being a super animal or a supergroup. Instead of just one organism making up the large animal, it's actually multiple organisms working together, like a super animal. Here's one example. The colonial obelia has different polyps. Polyp, again, is a type of body structure in cnidarians. They have feeding polyps with tentacles around their mouth. They're called hydrants. They also have reproductive polyps, whose main job in the colony is to produce sperm or egg. Colonial organism, or like we'd say a super animal here, with each polyp having a slightly different job and each part of this body doing slightly different. One part of the body releases these medusa forms, and these medusa forms are produced through what's called strobilation. It's going to be one of your vocab words. Those medusa then go out and swim in the sea, and they are the ones that produce sperm and egg. They meet, make a zygote, goes through blastulation, and then it creates this free-swimming larvae called a planula. That thing eventually settles down, starts to form a whole new colony. The colony grows until it reaches this form again. If we are talking about colonial organisms in this class, a lot of them have a very similar life cycle. You can just see a few examples here. Um, Another or two other species to talk about in this class, hydrozoa, are hydra and Portuguese man of war. So this is a hydra, right? It's polyp shaped. It actually has these little edges or stinging tentacles. Here's an example of it catching a water flea. It also reproduces both sexually and asexually. You can see both in this picture, where one, it's releasing an egg or from its ovary, and then two, you can see here a little bud. Um, this is the Portuguese man of war. It's called that because they look like the helmets on the actual Portuguese soldiers a long, long time ago. If you remember from very earlier, Portuguese men of war are one of the very few types of cnidarians that can actually hurt you because of their venom. Um, they usually condense in areas because of like wind currents and water currents. And oftentimes their tentacles can extend 20 feet beyond what you actually see. So you have to be really, really careful. Because as you can see here, not only does it leave welts, but they're extremely painful. And if you get too much venom in your body, you can die. So that's the first class, class Hydrozoa. The second class is class Scyphozoa. And class Scyphozoa is all of the true jellyfish. Think moon jellyfish, giant jellyfish. They all fit in this class. Nearly all float in the open sea. All are medusa shaped, and their bells can vary in like size and shape. But in general, that's kind of how their body plan works. Also, most are composed of what's called mesoglia, which is a combination of like water and protein. That's what makes it like jelly-like. Just a few examples. Here's the giant jellyfish, which can exceed 2 meters in diameter on its hood. The hood, again, is like the little bell part of the jellyfish. Well, they have arms and tentacles, and each one's got a slightly different function. This is the general body plan of a jellyfish. Here's another giant jellyfish. The most common type of jellyfish that most people know is this moon jellyfish. Moon jellyfish do not have stinging tentacles, so you don't have to worry about that. They just catch their prey with more like a stinging tentacle. And then these are what are called golden jellyfish. Hopefully you watched the little video about Jellyfish Lake and how these little guys survive, because it's really amazing. So reproduction method, it's similar to almost all other cnidarians, where there can be budding, and that's an asexual reproduction. But there's also strobilation, which is when a medusa is formed from a polyp. And that's a form of asexual reproduction, where you have a polyp that can form multiple medusas over and over and over again. like we'd see here, right? So something adheres to the substrate. It starts to make these like little discs. This process again is called strobilation. Each one of these little discs gets released, and each turns into a jellyfish. Those adult jellyfish can go meet other jellyfish, um, release sperm and egg, can be make another planula, which is the larvae, settles down, so on. So it's got this life cycle, a little similar to the one we talked about earlier. So comparing the two classes we've talked about, Hydrozoa was the first one with like Portuguese men of war, Hydra, Obelia, and Scyphozoa is our true jellyfish. Hydrozoa are mainly colonial, mainly live in polyp forms. If there's a medusa present, it's usually small, a little bit of mesoglia, less tentacles. Um, the other class have larger medusas. They have their cells present in mesoglia. They're more complex, they have more tentacles, and so on. Final class is class Anthozoa, which includes all of the coral and sea anemones. Class Anthozoa lack a medusa stage. They are all polyp. They are also all marine, but they can be found both in shallow and deep water, and the size of them can vary. Most are not harmful to humans because instead of having a nematocyst inside their cnidocytes, which is the cell, they have what are called spirocysts, which instead of having a venom and a barb, they're more of like a sticky thread to catch their prey. That's not all of them. There's a few exceptions here or there, but in general, most of them are harmless to humans because of this reason. The classic example for this class is sea anemones. Here's the general body structure of a sea anemone where you have these tentacles, which contain the cells that help to catch their prey. They have what's called an oral disc, which is similar to a mouth, where they'd bring in food kind of along these tentacles down into the oral disc. And then this is where food would be absorbed. It's also where food would be released. Sea anemones do have the ability to move. Hopefully, you saw that video with sea stars, which are one of their main predators. And a sea anemone can detach itself from the substrate, wiggle out, and then kind of move to a safer area. Most of you probably remember sea anemones from Finding Nemo and how clownfish and other little fish can use them as shelter because not all organisms can get past the tentacles of the sea anemone, so they use it as protection. So reproduction of sea anemones, you have both dioecious and monoecious organisms. Fertilization is external most of the time. The zygotes become a little larvae like we've seen so far, but there can also be what's called pedal laceration, where small pieces of a little disc break off, regenerate, and form a new sea anemone. And there can be budding that occurs. The other example besides sea anemone for this class are coral. And coral are just polyps that are surrounded by a calcium carbonate skeleton. Um, most people know that coral is alive or a coral reef is alive, but if you didn't know, um, let's discuss it. So if you've ever like held a piece of coral or touched a coral reef, it feels like a rock, right? And that's because they built this calcium carbonate skeleton surrounding them. Inside of that little rock-like structure is a living polyp. This is the reason why what's called coral bleaching is such an important issue because most people think when like coral die off, if the calcium carbonate like little rock structure is there, everything will be fine, but that's not true. When coral reef bleaching happens, the polyp inside dies, um, and it takes hundreds of thousands of years for little polyps to build those huge structures that we know of as the coral reefs. So it's not like it can be instantly fixed, instantly repopulated by new polyps. It takes time. The polyps inside the coral do have a little stinging spirocyst inside, which doesn't really penetrate through human skin. A few examples though, here's a thorny coral where you can see the little tentacles off to the side. This is a soft coral in the Pacific coral reef. These are some horny corals with like a sea fan, a red whip coral. Um, there's some exceptions to the rules. This is called fire coral. Fire coral does have nematocysts inside and it does sting like a jellyfish. Um, but the reason why coral reefs are really important is because they are home to a great amount of diversity of animal life in the oceans. Um, Coral reefs are basically like the tropical rainforest of the sea. Hundreds of thousands of different organisms live inside and around coral reefs because they provide protection, not only because of all the little cracks and like these shapes that give like hiding places for animals, but also because in areas where there's coral reefs, generally the flow of water is lessened a little bit. Water moves more slowly in those areas, so you don't have like large crashing waves. You don't have these fast water currents that can spread out life. It's all kind of populated in that little area. They're also usually close to the surface too. Close to the surface means more sunlight, more things that photosynthesize in an area. And so for all of those reasons, coral reefs are really, really important to ocean life. Um, you have plants and animals, usually limited to that top layer of the coral reef above the calcium carbonate deposits. Coral has a symbiotic relationship with algae, which is a type of protist. And together, they help the coral to make that calcium carbonate skeleton that most coral needs to survive. So coral requires warmth, light, and a certain amount of salinity to make sure that they're surviving and the algae inside of their body is surviving. Um, what the algae is doing is it's providing food for the coral and carbon for the calcium carbonate. Um, and it recycles phosphorus and nitrogenous waste or nitrogenous waste for the algae. Um, Most human impacts on coral reefs are negative impacts. Few examples. There are nutrient runoff from fertilizers and sewage that run into the oceans that threaten to kill the coral because they introduce a whole bunch of nutrients into the water that causes algae to grow at a rapid rate. And if the algae grow at too much of a rapid rate, what happens is that it basically starts to kill off the coral that they have the symbiotic relationship to, which is what causes coral bleaching. Um, there have been some examples of coral reefs withstanding like large amounts of pollution, like the Persian Gulf reefs, which have survived large amounts of oil pollution because of oil spills in the ocean. But most coral reefs are in fact threatened by factors of human origin, whether that's like troweling, which is fishing, where you run a net underneath a boat and you drag it along the ocean floor, um, large shipping rigs being large boats going through and driving through and damaging coral reefs. Climate change is a huge one. It's changing the whole ecosystem surrounding it, right? Coral need a specific temperature, a specific salinity, a specific amount of carbon in the water. With climate change, it literally changes all of those things, which impact the coral that can survive. All right, so I know that was a lot on Cnidarians, but hopefully you learned a little bit here and you found it interesting. Thank you for watching.